Judge Perry, today is the 29th of October, and we are here in 2010 at a building named after you, sir. And I'm just going to be asking about a certain portion of your life about World War II experiences, and you're growing up and going into the military. So it's really just an excerpt of your life. You grew up in South Carolina.
I did. I was born and reared here in Columbia, South Carolina. I grew up here. I attended the public schools here in Columbia, except that for a brief period, my mother took me and my sister and brother down to Tuskegee, Alabama, where my father was hospitalized at the Veterans Hospital in Tuskegee, Alabama. My father was a World War I veteran and had come down with an illness and was hospitalized in Tuskegee. And so we lived there during a very short period when I was in elementary school.
Do you know what unit your father was with or where he
I
went
do
in
not.
World War I?
I do know he served in Europe.
Do you know particularly in France?
Yes.
I can find his unit. It was
All right.
probably the 369th. Do you know, had you ever heard if he had trained in South Carolina?
Frankly, I know nothing of his military service except for the fact that he did serve in World War I and that he went overseas and served in France.
Do you have any idea if the illness was at all part of, say, the chemicals that had been used in World War I?
I had heard that he was exposed to mustard gas, which was a weapon used against American troops by the Germans during World War I. But I cannot confirm that. This is just family lore that I've heard.
And so he was cared for at this Veterans Hospital in Alabama, and that was your first trip to the Deep South?
Well, bear in mind I was born and reared in Columbia, South Carolina. And Columbia, South Carolina is a part of the Deep South.
So you went deeper into the South in
Yes,
Alabama,
yes,
that was.
yes.
Did you have any connection to the Tuskegee Institute or any of the sort of educational programs through
Well,
there?
we lived for the time not very far from the Tuskegee Institute campus, and I attended a school that I remember till this day called the Little Red Schoolhouse. A part of, I suppose, a part of the educational program at Tuskegee Institute. It must have been there for teaching purposes.
And the teachers were probably from there as
Yes,
well then too.
yes.
Oh, I bet they were. And all part of that normal school education and
That's
the
right.
Tuskegee, yeah, interesting.
But I remember my presence there in Tuskegee, Alabama, and my forays into the campus at Tuskegee. I recall having seen and had my mother point out with considerable interest a man who I later learned was a rather famous man, Dr. George Washington Carver. We saw him conducting some research in a wooded area, and my mother paused and said, "Now look at that man there." And she told me his name. He's a very famous man, had developed some renown because of his research into the use of, I forget what vegetation it was.
Peanuts.
Peanuts, yes.
Exactly. Well, and some people, I've heard this with people my age have said, well, we learned African American history because we learned about George Washington Carver in school. Do you
Yes.
remember? Not only did you then see who he was, that your mother knew this history.
Yes.
When you came back to South Carolina, was he one of the preeminent African Americans that you learned about?
Well, he was a preeminent person. I can't say that I focused heavily upon him. I became familiar with his name and his fame, which was considerable. And as a boy who grew up, being made aware of things around the country, his name surfaced. I would say rather frequently. I never had the occasion to study him in depth, but I came to appreciate the fact that he was an accomplished man.
Well, then you went toward different sciences too, but
Yes.
it also makes me wonder at this very early age that you're by this, the Tuskegee Institute, if in fact you started thinking about college and going to college, or had your mother and father impressed upon that, or had your father said you should go into the service?
No, my father never advocated my going into the service. Let me pause and say that my parents were not very educated people. I do not know the extent of my father's formal training, whether he had more than, well, he must, I believe he had something of a high school education. Whether he graduated from a high school as we know high schools today, I don't know. My mother did go to high school, and Benedict College here in Columbia back at the time had a school that was the equivalent of a high school. And so my mother attended that school. At least that's my information. Whether she graduated, I do not know, but I do know she was exposed to Benedict College in its secondary school sense.
So they probably had teachers again, like that they loaned to the high schools.
Yes.
Did they either one of them impress upon you that it was education was the way that you should go?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
You just said it.
So, how did it come about then that at the, and tell me how you got into the service instead of going straight into college?
I did go straight into college.
You did?
When I graduated from high school, Booker T. Washington High School here in Columbia, I enrolled at South Carolina State. Now that school is now known as South Carolina State University. That was not always its name. That school was founded back in approximately 1892 or thereabouts. I'm sure that it was founded before the 1895 Constitutional Convention in South Carolina.
It's a land grant college.
It was and is a land-grant college. And so I enrolled there. World War II occurred. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in either my freshman or sophomore year when I was there at South Carolina State as a student. And of course, during the next several months, the draft was enacted by the Congress, and many young men, I'm saying young men, I don't know whether young women were subject to the draft, but we did have many young women serving. And so eventually I was drafted into the military.
You should have had a deferment for a while you were attending college, but
Well, maybe I should have, but I didn't.
so by 1942, or you are going into the service?
Received the notice of my enlistment in late 1942. I reported in accordance with their directions in January 1943. And I served until, for 3 years, and was discharged in January 1946.
So the rest of the whole of World War II. So when you went in, were you aware or thinking about your father's service day, or were you also aware of the history of black soldiers in World War I or the Buffalo Soldiers from the West?
I was not. Grew into an awareness. I learned about it, but you ask, was I then aware? I cannot say that I was.
And when you went into the service, did they teach you about the Buffalo Soldiers or about the...
No.
So you're learning how to shoot and salute and the basic training? Where did you go to basic training?
In a wartime camp, no longer in existence as far as I know, called Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi. Somewhat adjacent or outside of Shelby, Mississippi. And that's where we did our basic training.
What unit did you get assigned to when you
I was in
finished?
the quartermaster.
And what division of the service? You're in the Army and you're in the 92nd or 93rd or some huge quartermaster unit?
There was such a designation, but I don't remember it. But I do know that ultimately in Europe, we were assigned to the Third Army. And the great General Patton was our ultimate commander.
I see. Well, actually, the Buffalo Soldiers that went to Italy had Mark Clark
Yes.
from South Carolina, who was
Yes.
their commander, if you will, and that, though he hardly passed by them. But perhaps you were used to segregated life being from South Carolina.
I most certainly was.
Yeah. So going into the service, were you surprised that things were segregated, or were you
No, as a matter of fact, being a black man, having been born and reared in South Carolina, I was accustomed to the folkways, the mores of life in certainly South Carolina and in such other places as I might have visited or been familiar with. The requirement of separation of the races was a fact. It had been officially decreed in a Supreme Court decision in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson. I was not aware of that case at the time. but I'm simply pointing out that in South Carolina and in every other place that I had any familiarity with, the races were separated. We went to schools that were racially segregated. I went to schools for black young people, and I attended a college that had was a land-grant college, but it was established for the education of colored people. So yes, I was very familiar with the requirement of racial separation, and I was also familiar with the practices of people who were white towards black citizens. We were treated, of course, as inferiors, and we were required to comport ourselves in the society, and certainly in relationship to people who were white, in a sort of a subservient fashion. Now, as a boy, you see, I grew up under that kind of a regimen. Now, did I fully appreciate what I was being exposed to? No, I did not. At first, you see, I did not perceive that it was wrong. It was just a fact of life. But as I grew, and as I gained very slowly an education, I did indeed begin to wonder about the fairness of many of the things that I was exposed to. Undoubtedly, I came to a point, I cannot tell you at how old I was at the time, when I decided that this isn't right. But was I able to address what I perceived to be the unfairness of it? No.